Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
We're starting off this series called Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes with The Perfect Couple. And I think we probably need to explain that we need an exclamation mark after each of these titles. The Perfect Couple exclamation mark. And we're going to be exploring, Mike, I think, the surprising story of the perfect couple. But first of all, just tell us, who are we talking about? Who is the perfect couple?
Yeah, I suppose any married couple would definitely want to put an exclamation mark after the perfect couple, because no matter how good our marriage and our relationship is, we all know we have those moments, don't we? But we are looking where everything began, at the very first couple that the Bible talks to us about, the characters of Adam and Eve, the first people that God makes, and of their relationship, and seeing how it was at the beginning, but sadly how things didn't quite work out as they were meant to as well.
Maybe we should perhaps begin by saying that they weren't a couple, of course, from the out, were they? Adam was, I guess, the first on the scene.
Yes, absolutely. And in a sense, our first surprise here in this story comes from the fact that Adam discovers he needs a woman. So what we get in Genesis chapter 1 is the story of God's creation of everything over that 6-day period. And as we've said in previous episodes, some Christians see that in a very literal way. Others see it as a picture of something far more complex, and we're not going to get bogged down in that today. But what stands out in that creation story is the climax of creation, is the creation of humankind. Humankind is the crown of creation. And chapter 1 ends with, well, a generalized statement where in verse 26, God says, "Let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish." Interesting, let them rule. So although he's going to start by creating one man, Adam, there's in God's mind very clearly already a them coming along, though Adam the man doesn't know it yet. In fact, in the Hebrew, the same word is used for man in the sense of mankind, humankind, and the man, the Adam, and it slips between the two. But by chapter 2, we've definitely got, it is zoomed in. Chapter 2 zooms in, having given us the overview in chapter 1 of the steady creation of all things crowning with man. Chapter 2 zooms in on the creation of the man, of Adam, created again in the image and likeness of God, created to in some ways be God-like and to be able to know God and reflect God. But he discovers that life is not fulfilled when he's on his own.
So this is where Eve, as we think of her, comes on the scene. But is she Eve again from the start?
No, she's not actually. She's not called Eve until we get to chapter 3. So at the beginning, she's simply the woman. And we're introduced to this woman as God has created the whole of this creation. It said that he brings all the animals to Adam for him to be able to name each one of them. But then there's this lovely little phrase in chapter 2 where it says, "But for Adam, no suitable helper was found." It's like, he's seeing all of these wonderful expressions of creation. And, the more we're able to see on things like TV programs, just the wonders of creation, we think, wow, wow, wow. But in all of that wow, there was still something missing. No suitable helper. The Hebrew word, therefore, suitable means corresponding, one who would fit him. And I suppose we could use that expression, that the other half, that it was like there was a bit of him missing, because there's still something missing in his life, even though he's got the wonders of this creation around him.
I feel that we probably should pause, like we no doubt will do throughout this series, to just remind ourselves, hang on a second, what you just said is that Adam, man, woman, have been created. I'm thinking, you see, in the world around us, you see, for example, sometimes vehicles with stickers on the back, which represent the evolution of mankind.
Oh, yes, I've seen those, yeah.
Which is sort of representing man evolving from apes. I guess that's the kind of image, isn't it? But we need to just say, hang on, this deserves an exclamation mark, does it not? That this is man and woman being created.
Yes, absolutely. And what I don't want to get bogged down in here is in a debate about whether God created everything in a literal 6-day period or a much longer period. But what I would want to fight for is this. Human beings are not just an accident. Now, that probably is a surprise, certainly to many non-Christian people today. However we interpret the account in Genesis 1 and 2, what we see is the steady progress and steady hand of God in forming a world in clear stages, and the crown of that, the height of that, being the creation of human beings. And what marks them out is not only are they created at the end of the period on day 6, because after all, animals are created on day 6 in the Genesis account as well. So that's interesting. It shows our clear link to the animal world by us both being created on day 6. And yet, in Genesis 1, they are created by a separate act of creation. It's as if the writer is wanting us to know that there is something that marks the human race out as different. Yeah, we're linked. We're both from the dust of the earth. This lovely picture in chapter 2 of Adam being created from the dust of the earth. And of course, we know that's exactly true these days. What are we? At one level, a bunch of chemicals. And yet there's something more. The first is that God breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. Well, it's not that in itself that makes us different from animals. That's just nephesh, that's livingness. What makes us different is that we are told we are made in the image of God, in the likeness of God, in chapter 1, verse 26. So I would want to contend very strongly that no matter how the human race came into being, it is quite distinct and quite different from the animal world, because only the human race is made in the image of God. Now, that doesn't mean like God woke up in the morning, looked at himself in a mirror and thought, oh, I'll make that. But what it means is there is something about us that reflects who God is, our ability to love and relate and make moral choices, good or bad. There is something about us that reflects what God is like. We're made in his image. We're made in his likeness. Actually, another important thing is Adam and Eve are created to rule over creation. In chapter 1, we read that God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Now, rule doesn't mean abuse, and sadly the human race has done that at times. Here is a picture of God putting the human race into the world to, well, use an old word here, to be his vice regents, to be his representatives on earth, to show what godly ruling looked like. Now, I'd be the first to say the human race hasn't always done that in a godly way. The way that we're looking after our world is coming back to bite us at the moment, isn't it? With some of the ecological problems that we've had, and we've seen that we have not ruled the world well. So here's what makes us different. Here's where I couldn't go along with that sticker on the back of the car from how does it start? A tadpole or something, doesn't it? And works up through apes and gorillas or whatever and ends up with a human being standing. No, we are far more than that, because we're made in the image of God, in the likeness of God. We're made to rule like him and be his representatives on earth and care for this world that he has created. And that's what marks out the human race as different. And that is a huge surprise for many people today.
So let's keep in mind Adam and Eve. We're referring to them as the perfect couple. You have already indicated that they were created to sort of complement one another.
Yes, I love this little phrase in chapter 2, verse 20. It says, "For Adam, no suitable helper was found." Just a couple of verses earlier, God says, "It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him."
There was nobody else around anyway.
Just animals. And they were great. I often imagine there was Adam, enjoying all these things and seeing all the different animals coming to him and having this great relationship with animals in a world that was unspoilt by human sin. And yet God sees there is still some sort of hole in his heart. There is still something missing. He needs a suitable helper. Let's just unpack those two words for a moment, because I think both of these are quite a surprise. That word suitable, I mentioned a few moments ago, means corresponding. Something that fits. I often think of this as like two pieces of a jigsaw, and there was Adam with his particular shape of a jigsaw, and there were all these animals around him that, you tried to fit it and you think, no, it doesn't fit. And even the ones that seemed to fit best, no, there was a little gap between the pieces. There was nothing really that fitted and clicked, nothing that corresponded to him, that was like him and could relate to him in the same way that he could relate to others. And then this word helper. Now, I think for many people, this will be a surprise, because the Hebrew word, Hebrew was the language that the Old Testament was originally written in. That word helper does absolutely not mean, I was going to say minion, but I always think of those little yellow creatures when I say that. But I suppose that works because they were created to serve, weren't they?
Assistant?
Assistant, yeah, assistant, that's a good word. That is not what it means. It's not assistant. It's not little Mrs. Stay-at-home type thing, which I know at times it has been used to mean, but that's not what the Hebrew word means here. In fact, this Hebrew word for helper is actually used of God himself. In Psalm 70, verse 5, it talks about God being our helper. Wow. Now, there's no sort of minion, servant, little missy picture there, is there? We know the relationship. And so this immediately takes away any sense that womankind is inferior to mankind in any way. I'm using mankind there in its specific sense, that women are in no sense less than men. The two of them are the two equal parts of humanity. And it takes both of them together to reflect the image of God. And again, we get that back in chapter 1, where God says, let us make man, let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness. And it goes on to say, so God created man in his own image, in the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So it needs both man and woman in their distinctiveness. I think that's probably interesting as well today. We live in a culture where people often try to blur the distinctions between male and female, and yet God delights in the distinctions. He doesn't delight in one being put down under the other. He delights in these being two bits of the jigsaw that fit together perfectly, that really are the perfect couple, unspoilt in this story by the sin, by the selfishness that leads to those irritations and arguments that can spoil relationships. So here is the perfect couple, male and female, equal before God, both needed to be a full expression of what God is like, and neither of them more superior to the other.
So if Adam and Eve, the perfect couple, kind of represent mankind, before you go on to say how it all went wrong, just describe the perfect life, the perfect existence that they were experiencing.
Well, that comes out, I suppose, at the very end of chapter 2 in just a very simple phrase, or a couple of phrases really. It talks about God creating woman for man to be his helper, to be this other half, to complement one another. Adam responds by saying, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." So he instantly recognizes there is something different about this gift of God that's quite different to all the animals. In fact, he's surprised. Here's another surprise in the story. The tone of the Hebrew there, "this is now," it's almost like I think to catch the tone of it, we'd have to say in English something like, "Wow, this is now what I was looking for and was meant for." Goes on then to say, "For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and they'll become one flesh." Now, clearly, a later editorial addition there by the author. There's no mother and father around at that point. But he's saying this is where marriage found its roots, in God taking a man and a woman and bringing them together and then becoming, or this old image here, one flesh, becoming one. So here's, while we're not given the details of, who took the bins out and who did the shopping, and I'm sure it had a cultural expression in those days, just like it would in our days today. But here's the picture of a perfect relationship, of them being one flesh, being as though they were one. It goes on to say the man and the wife were both naked and they felt no shame. And I think again there, a picture of utter openness to one another, nothing hidden. My goodness, how relationships would change if husbands and wives today had nothing hidden from one another, resolved that even if they'd got something embarrassing to own up to, they shared it openly and knew that they would find love and forgiveness, and rebuke occasionally, because I certainly get a few of those from my wife, and I'm sure you do too. But this picture of oneness, of one flesh, of openness to one another. And in chapter 3, all of this enjoyed in the presence of God. There's this picture of Adam and Eve being in this beautiful garden that God created, the Garden of Eden, where they can enjoy his presence, where, well, it's even described as God comes walking in the garden in the cool of the day, in the evening.
I was going to ask you about that. What does that mean?
I've no idea what it exactly meant, but what it is, of course, is a picture of the fact that human relationship is not just about interpersonal relationships. It's about also relationship with God. It's about being in a place where God is in your life and you are sharing everything with God. What it actually meant for God to walk in the garden, I really don't know. But it is certainly a picture of a spiritual dimension to life. So life at its fullest is not just life at a sort of social, relational, sexual level. It's at its fullest when there's a spiritual dimension and when husband and wife are allowing God in together to share the whole of their lives with him.
So it's not so much a reference to God sort of spying on them while they're in the garden, but that he's there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think very often people have that picture, don't they, of God almost being like the spy in the sky, just looking, waiting for I caught you out. This is a picture of wonderful intimacy and relationship and God wanting to share his life with them. After all, they're his representatives here on earth. He wants to bless them. He wants them to do well. He is for them, not against them.
And this Garden of Eden that they're in, it sounds like the perfect place. I mean, it's sometimes referred to, actually, isn't it, as paradise?
Yes, Eden, we're told it was a region between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. The word Eden means pleasure or delight. So that again reflects that, remember, the whole of the world is good. In fact, when God's finished creating the whole of the world in chapter 1, he looks upon it and he says it was very good. But within this very good world, there's this particular special garden, a place of pleasure and delight, reflecting its beauty and perfection before sin spoilt it. And so it's this idyllic garden where Adam and Eve could enjoy God's, how can I put it, his special presence. He's in the whole of the world, but there was something special about this presence. And the word paradise comes because when the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the word it used for garden was paradisos. And that's where the idea of Eden as a paradise arose.
So for Adam and Eve in this paradise, they weren't there just to exist. There was a purpose.
Yes, there was a purpose to be God's representatives here on earth, to be his image and to rule on his behalf. And of course, to fill the earth, to populate the earth. God wanted a world that was full of his representatives. And so one of their role would be to be the first parents of a godly family that would extend and would fill the whole earth with godly offspring.
But I remember you said earlier that the difference between the animals and humankind was that God gave humans moral choices.
Yes, and sadly in chapter 3, that's where it starts to go pear-shaped. We get the story of how God had said to Adam back in chapter 2. By the way, to Adam, Eve had not been created at this point. He told him that you're free to eat of any tree in this beautiful garden, but you must not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat of it, you will die. So there's this one tree. God's given them everything to enjoy. He's just said, there's one tree I don't want you to eat from. And of course, what ends up happening? That's the tree they eat from. Interestingly, Eve is the one who will eat from it first, tempted by this serpent creature. Words there where he says, did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden? The Hebrew there has the tone of, God didn't really say that, did he? Questioning, come on, how unreasonable. Of course, he still does that today, doesn't he? God didn't really say that you're not supposed to live like that, did he? How unreasonable. And the woman makes the mistake of getting into conversation with him. She says, well, we may eat from any tree in the garden, but God did say you're not to eat from that tree or even touch it. Oh, she added that bit, or even touch it. First example of legalism in the Bible there, adding to what God has said. And he convinces her to eat from it. She takes from it and gives it, the text says, to Adam who was with her. My goodness, no. It looks like this guy was there alongside watching all this happening and still didn't say, no, God told us we weren't to eat from that. So here is the first opportunity for them to exercise that moral choice, to do what is right. Did they understand why they shouldn't? Probably not. Do we always understand why God gives us particular commandments? Probably not. And yet that's where trust comes. That's where love comes. That's where faith comes. And God had said, you know, when you eat of that fruit, you will die. And in a sense, there was a double surprise because they did die and they didn't die. They didn't physically die that day, though death began its work. But something died within them. And whenever we disobey what God has said, a little bit more of us, something dies in us. And that relationship from God with this perfect couple was spoilt from that moment on, to the point where God has to judge both the woman and the man and the serpent, and by the end of chapter 3, expel them, banish them from this garden. Now, they're still out in the world. God still cares for them. There's this lovely touch of how he provides garments for them as he sends them out into the world, which after all he'd wanted them to fill and populate. And so here's a note of sadness, a sad surprise. In a sense, it ought not to have been a surprise because God had warned them what would happen if they ate from this fruit. And yet, although he had to bring his judgment, the surprise that he would still not let them go. He would still provide for them. And he still had a plan. He says to the serpent that although that serpent would be cursed and he put enmity between him and humankind, he promises that one day an offspring will come from this woman who would crush his head, whom by the time we get to the New Testament, we see is that descendant of Adam and Eve, Jesus, who indeed crushes Satan's head beneath his feet, the biggest surprise of all, whose roots start in this story.
Bearing in mind that this perfect couple in this perfect place had everything they needed, and yet they seemed to want more.
Oh my goodness, that really does seem to sum up what we're all like, isn't it? Finding that sense of satisfaction. Why did this happen? Do you know what? I don't know at the end of the day. Why is it that having everything, they still wanted this one thing? They'd been told they were ruling over everything. They had everything. Yet look at a little child today, you know, they can have everything and you say to them, don't touch that. Don't pick this. What is the one thing they will want to do? What is the one thing that we so often want to do? The one thing we're told not to do. Wet paint, do not touch. How many of us have just tried it to see? But this is, in a sense, both the blessing and the challenge of being human. This is what makes us far more than animals, this ability to choose between right and wrong, not just to operate by sheer instinct as animals do, but this gift of God to have moral choice. And in a sense, God took a risk. He creates human beings knowing there is potential for this, and yet feeling it is worth it to have this crown of his creation who could represent him here on earth. It was a risk. The surprise from a human point of view is that they get it wrong and ruin everything. The surprise from God's point of view is that even right from the beginning, he'll have a plan of how to put it right.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.